Welcome to First Christian Fellowship's Adult Bible Study. We continue with our in-depth study of Acts of the Apostles, and we're getting very close to the end. Today's lesson is about one of the most well-known stories of Paul found in the Bible. It's the shipwreck story. He is a Roman prisoner. In context here, he's in a Roman prison. He's a Roman prisoner on his way to Rome and survives a shipwreck, essentially. And that voyage description that we find here in chapter 27 of Acts, scholars say, is the single most detailed, descriptive story in the whole of the Bible. But scholars do not agree as to the significance, related to why such detail is there. Recall in previous lessons that Paul had a hearing before King Agrippa in the presence of that new governor Festus at Caesarea. They concluded that Paul had done nothing to deserve death or even imprisonment. However, he's still in prison because they could not release him to the public because he had demanded a trial before Caesar, who at the time would have been Nero. But Nero is a long way off from Caesarea. He's across to what at that time was considered the other side of the world. He's on the other side of the Mediterranean, on the northwest side of northern Italy, in the city of Rome. This necessitates a sea voyage, and that's the story that we will find here in the New Revised Standard Version, chapter 27. We'll read it in total. When it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Embarking on a ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea, that is, off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salome. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Haven near the city of Lasea. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose, so they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. But soon a violent wind, called the northeaster, rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Crota, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After hoisting it up, they took measure to undergird the ship, then feared that they would run onto Stytis. They lowered the sea anchor, and so were driven. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard, and on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and not have set sail from Crete, and thereby avoided this danger and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of God, to whom I belong, and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, and indeed God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. But when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boats into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day, and you have been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive, for none of you will lose a hair from your head.' After he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. In the morning they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned to run the ship ashore, if they could. So they cast off the anchor and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes and tied the steering oars, then hoisted the foresail to the wind. They made for the beach, but striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the forces of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land. and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Well, as it has been very clear here towards the end of Acts, Luke's writing is very clear, in this case extremely detailed, but there's some context that scholars provide that helps us understand some of what's here. So Paul and the other prisoners, guards and members, there were 276 of them, all survived this voyage. There is not a good argument among scholars as to why such a story with all this detail is here. It does not introduce any new theology. Some suggest it is to show that God's Holy Spirit carries through to see that promise made to Paul would be carried out despite all sorts of natural and man-made obstacles. That is, the gospel is to be sent to the Gentiles, will make it to Rome, to be present and presented by Paul. The details are here to document the seriousness of the attempts to stop it. Some add it also highlights the help of a Gentile Roman centurion Julius of the imperial cohort, without saying such, but implying such, that this man was very helpful, that he did things to save Paul. Dr. Robert Wall teaches, whatever his motivation was, Julius acts as a pagan agent of divine purpose is here. And it's by whom, this man, whom all those traveling with Paul are saved as far as the physical things that happen, such as him preventing them from killing the prisoners and so forth. Julius's actions to save all resulted in protecting the agent Paul, who was carrying out the gospel and thus protecting and ensuring fulfillment of prophecy. Most modern scholars reject the idea that the we here is Luke, the author, and suggest it is that the we is the resource person. Scholars also note that the first person telling of a shipwreck voyage was a very common literary technique and very common type stories at this time. In ancient Greek and Roman writings, often, especially in the Greek writings, the person, the first person, had himself among them where he could say, placed himself among them where he could say themselves, save themselves and ourselves and us and so forth, and to the story. And the reason for it was the story was unbelievable, and so people would accept it as a reliable source, reliable story, if there was a first-person witness. In this case, protecting the hero, and the hero being Paul. However, traditional Christianity has accepted the we here, of course, is Luke, the author of Acts and the author of the Gospel of Luke and the physician to Paul. Several commentaries note that the chapter is in 3 sections, the first 12 verses covering the first stage of the voyage, straightforward. The second covering that stormy sea episode, and the final one, the crew surviving the shipwreck with Paul's dogged determination to believe in God and to help teach them the same. No gospel is really preached here, There was no thing of bringing up Jesus per se, but the Christian values are displayed here. One of Paul's Christian companions here is mentioned very early in this chapter, was Aristobulus from Thessalonica, and this is assumed to be that same individual from Philemon and one of the other books of Paul, who we recall was dragged out of the town, out of the sanctuary, out of the community, and so forth, with Paul there by that Gentile mob in Ephesus. And so he is a traveling companion, apparently, of Paul and Timothy. And some scholars go as far as to suggest, without any hard evidence, that he is likely the resource person for whoever writes this story. Scholars teach that this chapter's author assumes you know an awful lot of seamanship of what was necessary to sail in the first century, and the dangers associated with the Mediterranean Sea, and even the detailed geography of that sea in the Mediterranean area. He assumes that you know that it's dangerous, for example, to sail in the fall, and the winter even more so, with shipping coming to a halt in wintertime. You know that making a southwestern turn on the open Mediterranean Sea in the wintertime exposes you to very erratic and dangerous winds. And also that you know Paul was that Rome was a major importer of wheat from the world, primarily from Egypt, and that you're aware that there was a major drought going on in the region, and therefore they're having to take these risky trips in the wintertime, and risk these ships, and that you know that the emperor had imposed new insurance policy, so to speak, to allow this to happen, so that the ship and the cargo were insured for these risky trips. We know the timing when this occurred. Verse 9 mentions the fast. What are they talking about? The fast specifically here is at that time in Paul's life, the Judeo-Christian, if you will, Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. This was the most holy day in the Jewish calendar and falls between roughly late September and early to mid-October. Historians note that holy day has passed, so therefore we know we're probably past all of September, or at least probably over in late October, if not later. The normal safety time of navigating the Mediterranean was over. It had been over. It's usually over about the time of the solstice. But shipping would have been halted by mid-September for sure until springtime. But a drought in the region likely caused a need for additional risky grain shipments, as where most scholars tend to go on the reason that this thing seems to, in other words, a justification why in the world anybody would be out there. Paul argues with them on the logic of this trip and for them not to go any further, midway through. He is not worried about when he gets to Rome. He's just worried about getting to Rome. But they elect otherwise, and such risky voyages were, in this case, being covered by this insurance, and therefore it was an emperor's decree that be done. So several scholars suggest that greed, that is money, issues of money, likely involved here. That, in other words, the world's value system, monetary system, is driving them to make the trip, risk the ship, risk the crew, because there is insurance on the other end. Plus, the crew notes that the harbor that they stopped midway through there in is not a place that you can overwinter, or maybe a place that you don't want to overwinter. So there's that issue in addition to the financial risk. But as we saw here, their decision proved disastrous. Sea historians say we need to appreciate that the geography of the Mediterranean here, as you read through this, to appreciate what's happening, and as they sail, that they're trying to protect themselves from the wind coming from both mainland and the wind coming off of those islands, especially those northern winds that are coming. So they, of course, decide to find a harbor that's not as exposed, and that's their effort. Scholars do not agree as to exactly the route that the ship actually followed, and if you try to search into this, you'll find all sorts of proposals. Not a lot of agreement. Several major routes proposed, but it is sufficient to say that they were traveling in a pattern that does not follow the prevailing wind much of the time, and that they were simply trying to sail in such a way to protect the ship to the extent possible, and the cargo and the crew. Because from October to April, such winds are very erratic on the Mediterranean and generate major problems. So they are using the various islands to protect them from the winds and places. But this northeasterner comes up here as mentioned. That's not just a wind blowing out of the northeast, folks. That's a hurricane type wind. It's a cyclonic wind, very powerful storm. Most scholars suggest the meal here at the end was not the Last Supper type event, but there are a number of evangelical type, fundamental evangelical types argue very strongly. They say that's what's going on, but modern scholars, academic scholars especially, just don't see the kind of wording there in the Greek that would suggest this is anything related to it. It's just a meal. They're hungry. They need to eat. And Paul's Judeo-Christian values is how he goes about eating that meal. He prays first, and then he breaks the bread. However, like I say, it's highly debated. So this chapter ends with this shipwreck. They're in the water, say that, either swimming or floating adrift on some piece of the ship, making it as best they can. They will make it safely. We'll see that, but since this story is ended and we are not yet have Paul in Rome, there must be another chapter, and there is. We'll take up that chapter in the next lesson. Hope you have a good Bible study. We'll see you another day.